Hello and welcome to our webinar series, Art and Architecture with Curt DiCamillo. My name is Ginevra Morris, Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical organization in the country, specializing in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. So today, in honor of Scottish Heritage Month, we bring you Tartan Tales, stories from historic Scottish houses. From the Roman Emperor Diocletian's palace in Croatia to Culzean Castle on the Ayrshire coast, historian and raconteur Curt DiCamillo will lead us on a fascinating tour of Scottish history using architecture and great houses as his guide. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. And I do want to note that we are still broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. Even if we were to lose connection, you will still have access to a full recording on our website as well as our YouTube channel. So as noted, our tour guide today is Curt DiCamillo, an internationally recognized authority on English country houses and the decorative arts. Curt joined American Ancestors in February of 2016 as our first curator of special collections. As curator, Curt provides strategic direction and expert guidance for organizing and exhibiting our extensive collection of family history-related artifacts. He has also led highly successful heritage tours for our organization to England, Scotland, and Italy, and has lectured extensively in the United States and abroad. Curt was previously Executive Director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation, USA. So, without further ado, I will turn things over to Curt.
Welcome everybody from Boston, where in honor of this lecture, it has been snowing all day, at least where I am in Boston. And actually, it doesn't look too different from what you see in front of you, which is Eilean Castle in the Highlands of Scotland. And I think that most people, when they picture Scotland, have this in the back of their mind. This is very old. This has a 13th century core. So it's very spooky. I've been there years and years ago, but it has amazing, amazing scenery around it. And that's something else that I think of when we think of Scotland. I have to also say, I'm thinking back to once when I was in Scotland in July, and it was 40 degrees and snowing. So actually it had to be colder than 40 degrees, didn't it? It must have been like 35. It was just amazing. From someone from the United States, to think that in July it could snow. Of course, it's almost middle of April and snowing here in Boston. But let's contrast what we see here with Eilean with a more sophisticated Scottish style. One, of course, that many of you have heard me talk about before, and that is Robert Adam, who I don't think anybody would disagree was the finest architect that Scotland ever produced. And a fan of mine, I'm a fan of his actually, because of his neoclassical designs. He was actually not a very nice human being, but he had an amazing eye and incredible talent. And what gave him the heft to create the neoclassical style were the excavations that he witnessed and the places he went that heretofore very few Western Europeans had, starting with Diocletian's palace, which you heard Ginevra mention in the beginning. So this is the largest palace anywhere in the world that remains from Roman times. It was built for the Emperor Diocletian. It's today in Croatia, and this is an amazing survival you see here, but there's even more of it when Adam came along in the 18th century, and he sketched this. And he was the very first European to sketch and to measure this incredible survival, and to see a little bit more of what Adam would have seen. This is a modern artist reconstruction of what the palace looked like, and there was much more of this here in Adam's time, as I said, than is today. What I love about this is that the emperor built this as his retirement home, which is quite the retirement home. So what Adam did was take these drawings, and it wasn't just here, it was also in Rome and in Pompeii, and came back and printed this book, Ruins of the Palace of the Emperor of Diocletian at Splatro in Dalmatia in 1764. And he dedicated it to the king, to George III, and this is the actual copy that was presented to the king. This was the beginning of the disbursement in a publication form of Adam's ideas. And we think of Adam as being a neoclassicist, and of course he was, but he also, late in his career, started designing in a castle style. And the most famous example of that is in Ayrshire, Culzean Castle, which hugs the Atlantic Ocean, now owned by the National Trust for Scotland, its premier property, in fact. And what Adam did, which is what every modern client of his wanted, a romantic outside, but all the latest luxuries and refinement of a Georgian interior on the inside. And you can see the perfect example of that with the dining room, which is everything that a neoclassical room should be. In this case, it's quite, I think, sedate and understated, but incredibly elegant. This does not begin to compare to, I think, one of the most impressive rooms, which is the drawing room, which is a circle, a bowed room that looks out over the Atlantic and has this wonderful sense of grandeur to it. The carpet reflecting the ceiling, and you can get a better view of that in this next slide, where you can feel the intensity of that plasterwork. And those colors that you see up there, what we would call pastel colors, those were Adam trademarks. And you can see in this next slide the lusciousness of these original colors on the ceiling and the plasterwork. Look how thick that Sphinx is and all those urns. This is just a tour de force of Adam's work. If anybody asked me to show them, to point them to something that was indicative of who Robert Adam was, this ceiling would be the perfect example. The biggest reason people come to Culzean is to see this famous oval staircase that Adam designed, 3 stories tall, different kinds of columns on each floor. We have Corinthian ones here. And if you pull back and look at it from the ground floor looking up, you can see to the top floor, which is now called the Eisenhower Hotel. And the reason it's called that is that after World War II, the country of Scotland wanted to thank then General Eisenhower for saving Europe during the war. And the National Trust of Scotland decided the thing to do would be to offer him a lifetime tenancy in the top floor here at Culzean. He loved it, and particularly because it was close to good golf, but also I think it was when he was in the White House, he often would speak about how wonderful it would be to get away to Culzean, away from the cares of being the chief executive of the most powerful country in the world. And today, you can come and stay here in these rooms that Eisenhower lived in, and you have a French chef, and amazing care is given to you. It's a wonderful place to sort of blend American and Scottish bits together. But we shouldn't think that classical style architecture didn't exist before Robert Adam came along in Scotland. What you see here is the largest house ever built in Scotland, and at one time it was the largest private residence in the Western Hemisphere. You can see that the esteemed architecture historian Ian Gow said the palace interiors were encrusted with art treasures like some fabulous coral wreath. The next slide is going to show us the photograph of this very same facade. And this, of course, is Hamilton Palace, the seat of the Dukes of Hamilton, which were and still are the premier peers of Scotland. And when I say peer, so the Duke is the highest ranking titled person in Scotland, and he represents the Queen or the monarch and always has. And this great house was one of the greatest treasure troves ever put together in Europe. And I say was because it was demolished in the 1920s. And this is actually a photograph of the demolition in progress. And there were 2 main reasons for this demolition. The first was previous dukes had been spendthrifts, and there had been a great sale of some of the contents here in 1882. And then in 1919, there was the final sale when everything that was left in the palace was sold, including the paneled rooms, and even the fireplaces were ripped out and sold. And the second reason for the demolition was, in their infinite wisdom, the family, who made a lot of money off of coal mines, tunneled underneath their own house, and it started to sink. So that's why it went. We do have photographs of it because they knew in 1919 it was an important house. It was photographed extensively before it was demolished. And here you see the entrance hall. We have another quote from Ian Gow that I think helps sum this space up. The entrance hall was peopled with bronze statuary and Irish black marble bases polished to such a gloss that they reflected the pavement like a mirror. Now, there's no part of this house that I've ever seen that you would call warm and fuzzy. This is not a welcoming space, but it is amazing, particularly when you realize where it was. It's not too far from Glasgow, but in the 18th century, this was the world beyond the civilized world, particularly to people from the continent like the French. And they would just be completely gobsmacked when they would come to this part of Scotland and see this treasure trove, oftentimes with things from their own culture that they didn't even know existed. The small dining room is one of the rooms that was saved during the demolition and sold. And you see a photograph of it here, probably about 1910. And this is the only one of the rooms that was sold that has been completely and successfully reassembled. And that was done here in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts, where this very same room lives today. And this is a photograph from the very same angle looking at that room. The museum has installed in those cases the best of its British and Irish silver collection. This room, as I discovered when I worked for the National Trust for Scotland, is a place of pilgrimage for Scots from all over the world because it is the only embodiment in a full sense of Scotland's greatest house. Now, the man who really brought this house to its height was the 10th Duke of Hamilton, who you see here, who had a lot of money and a lot of taste and lived at the right time. He also married, as is a good thing to do, a very rich woman. And in this case, his wife was Susan Beckford. Now, it's important to put into context just who Susan Beckford was. She was the only heir of William Beckford, who in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was the richest man in Britain. And this is a famous portrait of him by Joshua Reynolds. He was reclusive and strange. He built a house called Fonthill Abbey that had the tallest spire in England. Its purpose was to be taller than the spire of Salisbury Cathedral, which is still today the tallest spire in Britain at 404 feet. And this is his amazing house. He loved a sense of scale. So this is actually an 1823 engraving showing two people walking up the stairs of the entrance hall. And where I have that arrow is there specifically to point out the scale, because this is what Beckford loved. He was into theatrics. So these teeny tiny people walking this enormous hall. So this house, which sadly collapsed under its own weight in the 1820s, had amazing treasures, almost all of which came to Susan and therefore ended up in Hamilton Palace. And Beckford had this thing for collecting items that didn't have a lot of practical use. So for instance, here we have a solid gold teapot that he commissioned. This is solid 24 karat gold. It's not practical. It was never meant to be practical. If you pour hot water in here, it makes the gold so soft that it loses its form. So not practical. He loved big blingy things, and nobody does bling better than the Indians. And he got this incredible 17th century Indian jade vase that's covered with rubies and emeralds, very likely made for Shah Jahan, who built Taj Mahal. Beckford had a whole series of Indian art like this. Once again, very pretty, not very useful. This is possibly the coolest thing, I think. This is something that Beckford himself commissioned, a solid gold ladle with a very rare blue jade handle encrusted with rubies. I mean, golly gee willikers, that just blows my mind. I love that. But you put that Beckford stuff together with what the 10th Duke collected. And as I say, he lived at a very good time if you were rich and a collector. And the reason for that is he lived during the time of the French Revolutionary Wars and subsequently Napoleon. And what that meant, of course, was that the great French aristocratic collections were coming up for auction at very cheap prices because most of the emigres needed money. And he bought in huge quantities. So here in the tapestry drawing room that you see, every single thing in that photograph came from the Palace of Versailles, which once again, put in your mind in a palace near Glasgow, Scotland, something like this, and you could see how the average Frenchman would just be gobsmacked. What's not in this photograph, but was in fact in this room, are these two pieces, which are considered some of the finest 18th century French furniture ever made by one of the greatest French/German furniture makers who ever lived, Jean-Henri Riesner. These were made for a very famous woman, and of course, I think you can all guess her name. It was Marie Antoinette, and they were made for her apartments at Versailles, but she ultimately moved them to Saint-Cloud, which was her favorite residence. After the Revolution, they were bought by the Duke, and then in the 1882 sale of the contents of Hamilton Palace, they were bought by another formidable woman, Alva Vanderbilt, who you see here, mother of the famous Consuelo Vanderbilt. Not a woman you want to mess with. The thing I love about this is her daughter Consuelo remembering these two pieces in her parents' New York City home. I mean, can you imagine growing up with this as just a place where you dropped your school book when you came in from school? And when Alva's husband died in 1920, he bequeathed them to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is why you can find them today here among some of the finest French period rooms in the world. The Met has an amazing sequence of French period rooms that I don't think can be equaled anywhere outside of France. And even there's a run for their money. Back to Hamilton Palace, we're going to go to the Long Gallery, which, like most long galleries in British houses, was meant for exercise and also fitted out with family portraits, which is what you see here. But there are two other things I want to point out. The first one are those incredible black marble fireplaces, 12 feet long, 7 feet high. And then the second thing is that throne, that canopied throne at the end of the room. Something that's, oh, thank you, Ginevra. Something I think is really interesting is that dukes are the only level of the British peerage that actually are considered to have reigned like a monarch does, and doesn't exist anymore in any house that I've ever seen, but they actually would have a throne sometimes. But it's the fireplaces we want to talk about here, because at the 1919 sale, they were bought by William Randolph Hearst, of course. And as I'm sure many of you know, Hearst or his heirs periodically would sell things from his New York warehouse. And these two fireplaces were sold to the firm of Dalva Brothers in New York, who deal with architectural heritage. And the last I heard, which is about probably 10 years ago now, they were for sale for about, I think, $200,000 each. The thing to remember is fireplaces have gotten to be very big business. 18th century fireplaces, there are firms in London that sell nothing but fireplaces. And when you contrast that with the 1950s, when these houses were being demolished and nobody wanted these things, and I had a friend who went in and said to the guys demolishing the house, I'll give you £5 if you put that Robert Adam fireplace in the boot of my car, to $200,000. Wow. Closer to home, here in Boston, a friend of mine, probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, came to me and said, I had this thing that I bought at an antique store in Boston. I've never known exactly what it is. Do you know? And I didn't know. But I went to some genealogy experts at the so-called New England Genealogical Society. That's what he thought it was. Of course, it was us, the wonderful American ancestors. And with their help, we were able to identify that these are the arms of the 10th Duke of Hamilton. This is the man who created Hamilton Palace as it was before its demolition. And that was cool in and of itself. But then the thing is, what was this thing? What is this thing? It's almost 4 feet tall. It's carved in gilded wood. It has at the very top there the coronet of a Duke of Great Britain, which is strawberry leaves. And what we think we figured out by going over the auction catalogs from the sale of the palace is that this was the top, the finial of a mirror, a pier glass that would have been probably at least 15 feet tall. So think about that. And there probably would have been more than one of these. And the fact that it ended up in an antique store in Boston, nobody knowing what it was, just is one of those wonderful moments, those antique roadshow moments. So the 10th Duke was an unusual guy. He was obsessed with death, specifically mummies and Egyptian death. He built this mausoleum for himself and for his family. There were 17 members of his family who had died, who were buried in a vault underneath the house, and he built this, had their bodies transferred there, and then he bought this 3,000-year-old Egyptian sarcophagus, and he had said he was going to donate it to the British Museum, but instead he decided he was going to be buried in it. And he also wanted to be mummified in the ancient Egyptian way. This all happened. Turned out that somebody didn't think to measure the Duke and the sarcophagus, because it turned out he was too long, so they had to cut off his feet, put them to one side so they could fit him in the sarcophagus. Sadly, in the 1920s, the building started to sink, and then there were floods from the River Clyde nearby. So all the bodies were taken out in 1921 and reburied in more traditional ground, including the Duke in his sarcophagus. I think that's so amazing. But let's go to the inside of this amazing space, because it has two interesting qualities to it, and both of them are acoustical. It had, until about, I think, 5 years ago, the world's record for the longest man-made echo in the world, 15 seconds. And you can experience that today. This is now, this building and the former kennels are all that exists from the palace, and they're part of a public park that's run by the government, so anybody can come in here today. And the thing to do is to shut the door to the mausoleum, and it will take 15 seconds until the sound comes back at you from the other end. The other thing it has is this amazing whispering quality. So 2 people go into the mausoleum, each of them go to opposite sides, they face the wall of their sides, and they whisper. And the conversation can be heard by the other person at the other end of the room as if they were right there over your shoulder. And of course, this was modeled on the Roman Pantheon. Like so many things in our world, it goes back to ancient Rome. This, which was for over 1,000 years, the largest dome in the world. So let's fast forward to World War II. And why am I showing you a Messerschmitt 110 bombing London? Well, that's because a Messerschmitt 110 is what crashed in Scotland, once again near Glasgow, in Dumfriesshire, on May 10th, 1941. And this is the only known photograph of the remains of that plane. Now, why this is important is who was piloting that plane. And his name, of course, was Rudolf Hess. Now, Hess has come down to us as a huge mystery, and I don't think we will ever know the real story of why he left and what happened subsequent, what secrets he may have kept. This is a huge amount of speculation. But the generally accepted story is that he was horrified by the carnage during World War II, that he saw all the dead bodies, the dead German bodies, and he wanted to make peace with the British. So he stole a plane, a Messerschmitt 110, and flew it, which is amazing, from Germany to Scotland, specifically to see the then Duke, in this case, the 14th Duke, which you see here. And of course, this is where the speculation comes in, like why? Why is he going to see this man who he's never met? The only thing that makes any sense is that the Duke, who was then called Lord Clydesdale, he hadn't inherited the title yet, was a pilot himself, and of course Hess was a pilot, and the Duke flew his own plane in 1936 to Berlin to observe the Summer Olympics. Not in itself a suspicious thing as indicating a German sympathizer, which is what Hess thought he was. And there certainly were a large number, actually, of British aristocrats who were German sympathizers, who believed that Hitler was the future, that fascism was the way to go. Unfortunately, there are all people who believe that today. Anyhow, he was part of a big group that was invited from the British Parliament to come to the game. So why pick on this one guy? The thing that we think is that Hess went to him because he thought that the Duke was a friend of the king's, which he was. And he thought that he could go to the king and say, hey, king, stop the war. And that revealed his ignorance of British politics because, of course, the British monarch doesn't have that kind of power that's vested in the prime minister. The other thing that's interesting is that the proposal he was bringing with him was that if Britain would drop out of the war, Germany would allow them to keep their empire if Britain would allow Germany just to have all of Europe to itself. Now, that aside, we have to talk about the Duke for an amazing thing that he did. He wasn't just a pilot. He set a record. He was part of the team, the very first team that ever flew over Mount Everest. And this is an actual photograph of the team of them in 1933 flying over Everest. That by itself was amazing, but as you can see from this text here, it was also hugely important because it proved the need for pressurized cabins. So think about this. These are open cockpit biplanes flying over Mount Everest. Can you imagine how cold that must have been? Now, back to Hess for just a second. So as you can imagine, everybody knew this was a big thing, so parts of his plane were saved from the very beginning. He, of course, spent the rest of his life in prison, in Spandau prison in West Germany, dying in his 90s, never speaking to anybody. As I say, that kind of thing just spurs all kinds of controversy. This is in the Imperial War Museum in London, which if you haven't been there, I despise war, but oh my God, it's so cool. I have a Scottish friend who I was talking to about this lecture a few weeks ago, and she said, oh, my father was there. He was one of the men who ran up when they saw this plane crash, and he thought this might be important, so he put part of his parachute cord into his pocket because he thought nobody would miss it. And this is her framed parachute cord from Rudolf Hess in her flat, which I think is just so cool. So the family have come down in the world, the Hamiltons. This is their house now, Lennox Love House in Lothian. So this is a medieval core house that's been altered in the 19th and 20th centuries, but nowhere near as grand as what we saw at Hamilton Palace. It has in its interiors little snapshots of various time periods when it was built. The Great Hall is very much what you'd expect from a medieval Scottish house because it looks pretty doggone creepy. This is actually set up for, I believe, a wedding. You can have dinners here, weddings here. I was very lucky enough to take a group here 5 or 6 years ago. I don't want to concentrate on this because this talks about Scotland's very dark and bloody past, and let me tell you what, Scotland's past is really dark and bloody. Let's look instead at a 19th century room at Lennox Love, the drawing room, which is what a proper British country house should look like, in my opinion. The other reason that people come here, scholars come here, is because of Mary Queen of Scots, who was very close to the Hamilton family. So there are an amazing amount of relics of hers here. I'm only going to show you 2 of them, which is her death mask, which you see here, which is the only known copy made directly from her face after she was beheaded, and her sapphire ring, which was given by her to the then Marquess of Hamilton, which is, Scotland's history is just astonishing. It's very bloody, but boy, oh boy, does it make good stories. On a more refined Scottish moment, let's go to London and see Sir Lawrence Dundas with his grandson. So this is a very famous painting in my world by Johan Zoffany, the famous German artist who painted a lot of British royalty and the aristocracy. This shows Sir Lawrence in his London townhouse. Now, he was a proud Scot. He made a fortune supplying the British Army with goods during the 7 Years' War. He took that fortune and entered politics and became a banker, made even more money, ended up building or buying houses all over the British Isles. And of course, anybody who wanted to be a power player, which he did, had to have a house in London. What's interesting about this is that it's less of a portrait and more of a conversation piece, because for us as scholars, this is a wonderful snapshot of an 18th century interior, just as it was put together. And more particularly, this room was designed by Robert Adam because Dundas employed fellow Scots. And today, a lot of these paintings are still with the family. The house has very sadly been demolished, and the Dundas family has been reduced to just one house, poor things, in Yorkshire, which is called Ask Hall, which you see here, which is randomly open to the public. But there's a cool thing that Sir Lawrence did. He started on the grounds of this house in Yorkshire, because he bought this house too, the first, or one of the first, race course in the United Kingdom, and it was called the Richmond Gold Cup. I don't think it ran for more than 10 years, and the winner got this, the Richmond Race Cup. We know that 6 of these were made. The one you see here is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This is vermeil, which is gold over silver. This is an astonishing work of the British silversmiths art. But what's more important to me is that it was designed by Robert Adam, and that by itself is cool. But seminally, what's cool is that this is the very first instance we have of a trophy of some sort in this shape being given to a winner of a sporting event. And this, of course, was taken by Adam from Roman funerary urns. So every time you see something that is a loving cup or a trophy, it derives from this. And ultimately, it comes down to a Scot. I said that Sir Lawrence was very proud of his Scottish heritage, so he didn't just have a London townhouse. He built a townhouse in Edinburgh, which you see here, which is still called today Dundas House. And you can see here in 1780, when it was almost brand new, it was called incomparably the handsomest townhouse we ever saw by Hugo Arnaud. Walk in today to the entrance hall just as it would have been in Sir Lawrence's time, and it's what you would expect for a beautiful Georgian townhouse. What's a bit more surprising is when you come into the 1857 banking hall, because it was built, as you might think, in 1857, and though it very much respects the neoclassical precedent of the original house, it was made for banking. And that's because since 1825, this building has been the headquarters of the Royal Bank of Scotland. And subsequently, today, it's the headquarters of the NatWest Group, one of the largest banking groups in Britain, which owns the Royal Bank. And it's something the Royal Bank has always been proud of. If you look here on the reverse of this 1967 banknote, a £1 banknote, you can see where I have that red arrow. That is Dundas House. And what's interesting about this, I have to have a sidebar here, is that something that we don't have in America, actually many countries don't have. Scotland is the only country in the United Kingdom that allows 3 private banks to issue their own banknotes. So you have the Clydesdale Bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and the Bank of Scotland. They each, to this very day, issue their own banknotes, and they can put whatever they want on them. And I think it's wonderful that they chose to highlight this building. For pure Scottish bling, architecture-wise, you can't beat Glamis Castle. There was, as so many times, an earlier house here, but what you see here was primarily built in the 17th century, and this is the archetypal Scottish baronial style. This could only be Scottish. This has been, since it was built, the home of the Earls of Strathmore. The Queen Mother, for instance, grew up here. She was a Strathmore. There's a lot of skullduggery that's going on around here. The most impressive room in the house is the Great Hall, which, like most of these Scottish buildings, is very Scottish. Beautiful Scottish Renaissance plasterwork on the ceiling. What I find really interesting about this, one of the portraits hanging in this room, is of the man who pretty much left the house as we see it today, the 3rd Earl of Strathmore. We're going to say a lot about this guy. First, he was really proud of the fact that he rebuilt the house and left it as we see it today, and that's why he's pointing, and why I have that red arrow, to the castle. But let's talk about his flesh-colored armor that is strangely erotic and unlike anything I have ever seen in British portraiture. That's all I can say, except wow. The other wow thing for him is that he was the last person in the British Isles to employ his own court jester. This had fallen out of fashion really by the end of the Middle Ages, And he was so rich and so eccentric that he had a court jester that was there to entertain him and his guests. His descendant, Princess Margaret, was born here in 1930. She was just gorgeous. I mean, look at that photograph, just amazing. And what I think is cool about this is that she was the last royal birth that was required to be witnessed by government ministers. And I'm talking about a government minister had to be present to actually watch her come out of her mother's womb. And the reason for that is because of baby swapping that either did go on or was suspected to go on for the past 300 years. Basically, everybody wanted a boy. And if you were a queen and you had a girl and you were always prepared for this, you would have a local peasant woman who had a newborn boy waiting in another room just in case, and you would switch them out before anybody noticed. So there was a law passed that required every royal birth to be witnessed by a government minister to make sure it was what it really said. Pretty wacky, huh? The biggest reason that people come here is because of this piece of stone. This is an astonishing survival. We think it's probably the 9th century Celtic carvings. It's a gravestone, and it's on the grounds of the house, between the house and the chapel or the church. And it's the gravestone of King Malcolm II, the King of Scotland, who died in 1034. And you might ask, how is it that his gravestone is older than him? And that's because we're pretty sure that this is a piece of Pictish stone, a Bronze Age stone that was reused and recarved for him. Why Malcolm is interesting to us is that he was King Duncan's grandfather. Now, Duncan, you may remember, was killed by this man, at least by Shakespeare's telling. Macbeth, of course, in reality, did not kill Duncan. He was part of a troop, part of a battle where Duncan was killed, but he wasn't murdered. But still, if you read Macbeth, what Shakespeare says is that Macbeth lived at Glamis Castle. So because of that, and because of the pieces we have like that gravestone, this is ground zero for Macbeth. People come from all over the world to look at this Scottish castle, which is very grand, still owned by the Earl of Strathmore today. And whether it's true or not, there's enough pieces together here that could make you want to walk back into the mists of time. Now we can contrast that completely with the sophistication of Robert Adam again. This time, this is Robert Adam and his brothers, all of whom were architects, and they together in the 1850s created this house for the 5th Earl of Dumfries, and it was saved by Prince Charles. And that story in and of itself is amazing, because in 2007, the house and its contents was going to be sold. And there was a great fear in preservation circles about the sale of the contents, which were hugely important. You see the Christie's auction catalog here to volume 1. There are 2 volumes of this catalog, and these things are so rare now that they go for up to $1,000 for the 2 of them, because the sale never took place. What happened was Prince Charles, I don't think, was even aware of this house's existence. And literally, as the trucks from Christie's were driving from Scotland to London to auction these contents, Prince Charles, in the 12th, I wouldn't say 11th hour, 11th and a half hour deal, got on the phone and signed a guarantee of £20 million to buy everything, the house and the contents. And the trucks turned around and went back to Scotland. And what Prince Charles did was save a house that was rare for all kinds of reasons, but most particularly because it was one of the very few houses, it is one of the very few houses in the British Empire that still has almost all of its original contents, most of which were designed for the house by Thomas Chippendale. For instance, almost everything you see here in this family parlor was made by Chippendale for the house. And the great fear among preservationists was that once the contents, which were exceptional, were sold, nobody would want the house. The house is not in the most picturesque part of Scotland. It was near abandoned coal fields, and there's a feeling that nobody would buy the house and it would just molder away. So Prince Charles put all this into a nonprofit foundation and runs it as a study center and a visitor attraction. And oh boy, is it amazing. He paid recently for the restoration of Chippendale's famous four-poster bed, which you see here, which is returned to a reproduction of the original silk that hung on it. And of course, as you can imagine, made by the man himself. The most famous piece of Chippendale furniture in the sale was this break front bookcase that could have gone for as much as $10 million. The estimate was up to 7, and we know people were willing to pay up to $15 million just for this one piece. It's one of the most amazing things that Chippendale ever created, and it's very reassuring to know that it's still in the place where it was intended to be from its creation. Dumfries House, to me, is a very comfortable house. It's not overawed, doesn't have enormous rooms, and I think the entrance hall right here gives you a perfect example of that. This is comfortable, it's welcoming, it's not too big. It's very much like when it was in the 18th century. Prince Charles has done so much to try to keep it back to the way it was. If you look to that screen there, those Doric columns holding up a frieze, we're going to take a little zoom in on the plasterwork there because I think there's some interesting stuff going on there. First of all, above it all, in painted plasterwork, you have the arms of the 5th Earl of Dumfries, who built the house. But what I want to particularly point out is the 5th Earl showing off. So in the frieze, you have where that arrow is, the star of the Order of the Thistle, which had been bestowed upon the Earl, which he was very proud of. The Order of the Thistle is the 2nd highest rank of chivalry in Britain after the Order of the Garter, and it's the highest rank you can have in Scotland. And this is a man who had arrived and wanted everybody to know it. Possibly, I think, the sweetest space in this house is the pewter corridor, which you see here, beautifully restored by Prince Charles. It had been painted over in just one color over the years to save money, I think, probably on picking it out. This is its original configuration, and it's based very much on the kind of things that you would see if you went to Raphael's Vatican Loggia. And of course, Raphael himself was channeling what was being discovered in ancient Rome from the Romans. So this is actually sort of a descendant of that. And Prince Charles himself actually comes here rather frequently and spends the weekend. And when you take a tour of the house and you get to the bedroom hallway, which you see here, you can look into Prince Charles's bedroom, which I think is wicked cool. He also has this habit of coming up on Fridays for long weekends and surprisingly tacking himself onto a tour, the last tour of the day usually, not announcing himself, just sort of coming up in the rear, nobody knowing he's there until they turn around and find him. As you can probably tell, I have an enormous amount of admiration for what Prince Charles does. It's hard to contrast more strongly what we just saw at Dumfries House with another D house, Drumlanrig Castle in Dumfriesshire, which you see here, which was built primarily in the 17th century from what was once a pink stone. This is one of the houses of the Duke of Buccleuch, who is the largest landowner in Europe, which is pretty astonishing. Let's take a close-up on this entrance facade, because this, once again, is a perfect example of the surprising sophistication of what you would find in what was pretty much the middle of nowhere in Scotland when this was built in the 17th century. These are Renaissance details, and what it shows you is evidence of the old alliance between France and Scotland, because they always come together against their common enemy, England. Basically, England was everybody's enemy. And you see the influence of France, you also see the influence of Italy here. This is an astonishing house, small rooms, but luscious things in those rooms. And it's part of an enormous estate, about 110,000 acres. A lot of it like this. These are many castle ruins dotted along here, and you can see sheep in the far left there grazing in the background. I was very lucky, actually, once I was here with the current Duke of Buccleuch, and there's this very big white thing way in the distance. And I said, what is that? He said, oh, that, we lease that to whatever, government agency. And I said, well, what does it do? He said, oh, that tracks all the air traffic going over the North Atlantic. It's like, Wow. And it's not just land like this. The estate includes villages and towns, and in that case, that means everybody is paying rent to the Duke. Even the church is owned by the Duke. Let's take a quick peek inside to one of the most amazing rooms, which is the drawing room. Here you see this incredible cabinet that was made for Louis XIV for Versailles. This is one of only two made in the world. The other one is at the Getty in Los Angeles. And how it got here is an interesting tale, because the king, Louis XIV, gave it to his cousin, another king, Charles II, King of England, who gave it to his bastard son, the Duke of Monmouth, who is also the Duke of Buccleuch, which is how all this comes down to here. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that the current Duke is the only individual in the world to own a Leonardo da Vinci oil painting. This is what you see here, the Madonna of the Yarn Winder. This shows the Christ child holding up a yarn winder, which is supposed to symbolize his future crucifixion. This was very sadly stolen from Drumlanrig. This being Britain, they didn't have guns, they had knives, and they put the volunteer tour guides against the wall and they cut it out of its frame and rolled it up. It took many years, but the Duke was able to reacquire it, and now, I think very likely because of its theft, it now is on loan to the National Gallery in Edinburgh, which I suspect provides top-notch security. But it isn't just things like Leonardo. There are incredible paintings from all periods, including this amazing Rembrandt, an old woman reading, that supposedly was Rembrandt's mother. And you look at this and you know that this could only be Rembrandt, with the kind of subtlety and humanity he puts into her face. Every country house in Britain had a chapel or church either attached to the house or near it. And in this case, the Drumlanrig Church is just down the road. It's a sweet Georgian building, very austere from the outside. Doesn't prepare you when you get into the inside, when you see the Duke of Queensberry. The Duke of Queensberry is the one who built Drumlanrig. This is the tomb of the second Duke, and he's the one who built the house. Incredibly Baroque tomb. Amazing for this little country church in Dewar, Presbyterian Scotland. And of course, the Duke was a Presbyterian, a Protestant, that he would have this very sophisticated, very Catholic tomb. And if you look to the left of this photograph, you can see that column popping out there. That column, we'll see the full thing in the next photograph, is the baldachin that marks the entry part within the church of the tombs of the family. This, of course, is even more Catholic, because this is based on the most famous baldachin in the world, which, of course, is that Bernini did of St. Peter's in Rome. Once again, incredible sophistication running around between Scotland that people don't, I think, oftentimes suspect. So the second Duke had a townhouse in Edinburgh, as would be expected for his time, and we have a nice portrait of him here on the left. And that was Queensberry House, which you see here on the right, which still exists today. It's more or less attached to the Scottish Parliament complex. Last I heard, there was there's a bar in here for members of the Scottish Parliament. But why the second Duke is important is that he was instrumental in the Act of Union, which in 1707 joined, for the first time, England and Scotland together in a United Kingdom. And as he was signing the Act of Union in 1707, his 10-year-old son, who was nuts, escaped from Queensberry House, where he was confined, and went down into the basement of the house where the kitchens were. And there, this 10-year-old boy took a kitchen boy, put him on a spit, roasted him alive, and ate him. Yes, who else but Scotland could deliver such a story? The Dukes of Buccleuch have amazing collections, and they also have amazing houses. There are 5 houses I can think of off the top of my head that are owned by the Dukes of Buccleuch. This is another one. This is Howhill House in the Scottish borders. Relatively unimpressive house, mainly Georgian from the outside. The inside, once again, is pretty spectacular, but we need to talk about how the family got stuff, land, houses in this part of Scotland. The Duke of Buccleuch's last name is a triple barrel name. It's Montague Douglas Scott, so 3 different families over the times that have merged. And the Douglas part of that family was given this land by what is considered generally to be Scotland's greatest king, Robert the Bruce. And you see here in this next slide him at the Battle of Bannockburn, the site of the greatest Scottish victory over the English. And in the 14th century, this land was granted to the Douglas family by Robert the Bruce, and they have kept it ever since, which is something you just don't hear in America very often. Once again, like at Drumlanrig, the rooms are not terribly big or high ceiling. They're much more personal and intimate, and you can have a very good example of that here in the dining room. Actually, I have a lovely story about this dining room. I took a tour here probably 7 or 8 years ago, and we had lunch at this dining room table. And after lunch was served, we had coffee, and one of our members put some lovely sugar into their coffee. And when she took it to her lips, she exploded because, of course, she had put salt into her coffee. And that was something that I take away from this. But the real reason we're here is because of the silver. This house has one of the most important collections of silver in the world. Matter of fact, there are actual silver vaults underneath the house just for the silver, a number of walk-in vaults. I'm going to focus on just one, where Ginevra is very kindly moving her cursor where that red arrow is. That one candelabrum there, which is, as you can tell, enormous. It's about 4 feet tall, solid silver, made in 1830 by the Royal Silversmiths Garrards. Now, this tells the probably mythical origin of the name Buccleuch. And we have 3 characters in this play: the king on the right, the stag on the bottom, and the young Scot there on the left. The young Scot is not a young man who happens to be Scottish. His last name is Scott. Now, what happens is that the king is out hunting in the forest, and he's in a cleugh, which is Old Scots for a valley. And this stag charges him. And the young Scot sees what's about to happen and very improbably takes the stag, throws him over his shoulders, and saves the king's life. And as a result, the buck that was killed in the cleugh becomes Buccleuch. And you see this kind of reference all throughout the various Buccleuch houses. As I say, it's probably apocryphal, but it's a great story. This, to me, is the most wonderful room at Bow Hill. The saloon, which is more or less like a staircase hall. I'm extremely fond of yellow, particularly yellow-orange, and this is just an explosion of that with amazing paintings around it. But the one thing I'm going to focus on are these 3 great Mortlake tapestries. You can see one of them, the other 2 on the left and right of this one. These are the only known existence of this particular design being made by Mortlake in 1670. They were copied from the 9 paintings that still are in Hampton Court Palace that were bought by Charles I, by Mantegna's 9 pictures of the life of Caesar. And the thing to remember here is just how much having 1,000 years of art adds up. Supposedly, the Buccleuchs have so many tapestries that they can't possibly display them all. So every single British embassy in the world has a Buccleuch tapestry on loan to it. Yeah. The other thing that's pretty amazing is that Bow Hill has one of the most important collections in the world of miniatures. And here you see just a small snippet of them. The top 3 are all Cromwell's. That's Oliver Cromwell, of course, in the middle in his most famous depiction, and his wife on the left and his daughter on the right. But it goes on and on and on. It's an astonishing display, and only some of them, I would say maybe 200 of them, are displayed inside Bow Hill House today. And they're by the most important painters of the time, Nicholas Hilliard and Isaac Oliver, who were the 2 most important English portrait painters who ever lived of miniatures. Holbein. There are even 18th century depictions of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. Because the Buccleuchs were the Buccleuchs, they had the best artists paint the family. And this, to me, is possibly the sweetest painting in any British country house. This is Lady Caroline Scott, painted by Joshua Reynolds in 1777. Supposedly, he was painting her brother, which makes sense. She was not supposed to be painted. It makes sense because he was a boy and he was going to inherit the dukedom. She was only a girl. And she came in on a cold January day, dressed just like this, and walked past Reynolds. And he said, "Stop! I have to paint you. I have to paint you just like that." He did paint her brother, and we have that hanging in the dining room as well. But that's a very pale comparison to this wonderful, dear, sweet girl. Now, she was the daughter of this man, the third Duke of Buccleuch, who was painted by Thomas Gainsborough. Now, there's an awful lot here that I want to talk about. First of all, the red hair. Buccleuchs have red hair. Second of all, the genuine kindness in his face. The current Duke of Buccleuch not only shares his facial features, but also, I think, shares that gentle kindness. The third thing, this is one of the richest, most powerful men in Britain. And he's showing himself wearing nothing but a dark jacket, no grandeur. The only thing he has is that star we talked about earlier at Dumfries House, the Star of the Order of the Thistle, which by law, if you were given in the 18th century, you were required to wear. That's it. But best of all, he not only has a dog with him, he has his arms around the dog. And not just any dog, but a Dandy Dinmont. Dandy Dinmont, of course, is a Scottish terrier. And though the breed had existed before this, the name comes about from a character in one of Sir Walter Scott's novels, a man called Dandy Dinmont. And the breed attached itself to this, and it's sort of populated from that. And I think that is such a wonderful story. To show you the red hair continuation, this is a 1929 portrait of the current Duke's father as a child. Once again, a dog. Showing dogs in English portraits is not unusual. Showing them with this kind of affection is rare. And we take this same man and we see him in 1953 at his marriage to a gorgeous woman who was a model before she married the Duke. And think of this, 20,000 people lined the streets to watch them go to the wedding at St. Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh. But look who is sitting in the middle. This shows you how important the Buccleuchs are. The Queen came to their wedding. I mentioned Walter Scott. Well, Walter Scott, because his last name is Scott, was a member of the family, the extended family of the Montague Douglas Scotts. And this portrait is one of the most famous, once again with a dog, of Scott. And he was very much a part of the Buccleuch family. He wrote about them and is considered today to be an important member of the family. So I think everybody here has heard about rugby, the game of rugby, and it's always commonly assumed with natural reasoning that rugby was invented at Rugby School, a private school in Warwickshire that you see here. And this is actually rugby being played at Warwickshire today, very much what you would expect. But in fact, rugby was not invented at Rugby School. It got popular at Rugby School. It was actually invented at Howhill House in 1815, and the very first game was watched by Sir Walter Scott. I mean, how about that for a home run for history? We have to talk about at least one 19th century house, and that's, I think, one of the grandest 19th century houses in all of Britain, Mount Stuart House, home of the Marquesses of Bute. This, by the way, is the same family that owned Dumfries House, and because they had so many houses and not as much money as they would like, they sold Dumfries House and decided to concentrate everything here at Mount Stuart. So look at this. This house was the first in Scotland to have electricity. It had hot water pipes and central heating. For any of you who've been to Scotland in the 21st century in the winter, you can attest, as I can, that every house does not have central heating. But most important of all, it was the first indoor heated swimming pool in the world. Let's talk a little bit about the man who created this house, the third Marquess of Bute, an unusual fellow. You can see here from this photograph, he liked to dress in, so we say, medieval garb. He was also one of the richest men in Britain. He was a very big patron of the arts, particularly of architects. In 1868, in a hugely controversial move, he was received into the Catholic Church. This was Not good news for the establishment, particularly in Scotland, where it's very Protestant. You can see here when he built this house, he had images like this of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, very Catholic, built on the outside of the house. That association continues as you go inside. Look at this entrance hall to his house, the marble hall. I mean, if you didn't think this man was a Catholic, I don't know what could convince you otherwise. It's just astonishing. I mean, it is just astonishing. And you go from here up the marble staircase to the bedrooms. And this isn't just a staircase. He used all different kinds of colored stone, if you can look up into the left, upper left there. And, you know, very sadly, by 1960s, this house was considered such a horrible thing that the then Marquis advertised it for sale for anybody who would tear it down, and nobody bought it. Thank goodness. This is Lord Bute's bedroom. I love this. He designed this bedroom with the architect's help. This is one of the simpler rooms in the house. But what is most wonderful about this is that if you lie on that bed and look directly up, there's a little dome, and that's what you see there on the right. And that is the night sky, the night that Lord Bute was born or built. And supposedly his servant said that when he would lie up there and look at that night sky, it would make him very happy, which is why I have that little green happy face up there. He was actually, I think, a very misunderstood man and very kind. He was obsessed with astrology, thus the night sky here. He was into mysticism, which is why he probably converted to the Catholic Church. But he was kind and gave enormous amounts of money to charities. Back to the Catholicism thing again. He was very taken by what I think is one of the most beautiful churches in the world, Saint-Chapelle in Paris, which was built in the 13th century. And if you look at this space, it's just astonishing. It's amazing, particularly in the medieval engineering skills of the time, that this thing even could hold itself up. So Lord Bute wanted the same kind of thing on a smaller scale for his Catholic chapel at Mount Stort, and this is what he built. All in white Carrara marble. The dome up there, which has sort of a reddish pinkish glow, is there because it's all lit by red stained glass windows to symbolize the blood of Christ. As you can see, you can get married here today. The room is set for a marriage here. And I have a friend, an English friend, who actually went to a wedding here probably about 15 years ago in August. And she said, and I quote, it was a one-way ticket to hypothermia. And she said to me, and it was in August, Curt, August. So the best, coolest room, of course, that we have to see in this house is the swimming pool, which was only restored in the 1990s. It had fallen into misuse, but I love this. The height of Victorian engineering architecture, very much like what you would see at a club. Now, we have to talk about the most important last battle in British history, and that, of course, is the Battle of Culloden. And this is the 275th anniversary of the battle this year. This is the last battle fought on British soil. And you see the government troops on the right and the Scots on the left. Of course, the Scots lost. This battlefield, which is truly a place of pilgrimage, is owned by the National Trust for Scotland today. And the man who led the government troops was the Duke of Cumberland, who was the son of the king, a son of the king, George II, and was pretty vicious. And the Scots called him then and still call him today the Butcher Cumberland. Sorry, the Butcher Cumberland. He was pretty vicious. Even after he won the battle, he had his troops go down and track down every single Scottish person who was known to be in the battlefield, destroy their families, their homes. Pretty nasty piece of work. But of course, he was a big hero in England. And to celebrate, they named a flower after him, Sweet William, which I think is a beautiful flower associated with such a horrible human being. So, of course, this, as you can imagine, seriously pissed off the Scots. So they said, okay, we're not having any of that. So they went through the existing plants found commonly in Scotland, came up with ragwort. And they decided that it needed to be renamed in honor of the Butcher Cumberland, or the Butcher of Culloden. And they renamed it Stinking Billy, which of course seems very appropriate. Now, speaking of appropriate, I want you all to know that my cat Miles had his annual physical just 2 days ago. He's 7 years old now, and the vet said that he was in spectacular health. And every time I take him there, they always say the same thing to me at the vet. He's such a sweet, dear kid. We love having him, and he never uses his claws or bites anybody. And here he is looking particularly sweet in my bed just about a month ago. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Curt, for your fantastic and entertaining presentation. Before we get to your questions, I'm excited to announce several upcoming art and architecture programs coming up next month. So on May 13th, Curt will present on the untold story of Jewish families and their English country houses. On May 20th, join us for a virtual lecture and musical performance of the Beggar Songbook, highlighting 17th century English, Spanish, and Dutch music that the Pilgrims would have likely heard during their time in the Netherlands. And finally, on May 21st, curators Nancy Carlisle and Peter Trippi from Historic New England will present on their new exhibit that examines the stories behind 45 of their most intriguing paintings, and that program will be moderated by Curt DiCamillo. And to learn more and to register for these programs, please visit americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. All right, so let's get to some of your questions. Go ahead and type them into the question panel. Of course, Lisa reminds us that the Battle of Culloden was 275 years ago today. So it's certainly a timely discussion and presentation for that anniversary.
And I did not know that, actually, that it was today. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. So we have a few questions. Heidi asks, can any of the amazing artifacts from Hamilton Palace be found in the British Museum? Do you know if any of them ended up there?
They could. I do not know of any that ended up there. I mean, they were dispersed to the winds, as you can imagine, through these two sales in 1882 and 1919. The best place to go, as you won't be surprised to hear, is the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. They have, I think, 2 galleries of objects from Hamilton Palace in there. And they don't just have those collections, they are actually in negotiation to buy more and more pieces that come back to Scotland that they buy at auction. And there's actually a website dedicated to a virtual recreation, I don't think it's up yet, of Hamilton Palace. And that's possible, of course, because, as I said, photographs are taken of each of the rooms before it was demolished. So the idea is that you can go with your mouse and go from room to room and see all the art in its original places.
Great. We have a question. Let's see. Jeffrey asks if you can say any more about Illandonan Castle.
I don't know a lot about Illandonan. I mean, well, I can tell you a little bit. So it is 13th century, but it was pretty much rebuilt in the 1920s. It's not occupied now. It's owned by a charitable trust. In fact, I was reading just yesterday and researching it that the last census showed that nobody lived on the island where it is placed. I don't really know more about that. I have to be honest, this is not my period. I generally don't like things very much before the 18th century. It is incredibly photogenic. It is sort of, I think, the poster child for the Scottish house, and you'll see the exteriors of it used a lot in movies and television shows, but I really don't know much about it beyond that.
All right. Let's see. We have another question. Roger asks, what happened to the properties and homes of the Scottish nobles who supported the losing side at Culloden?
Oh, they were seized. I mean, if you supported the rebels, which they were called, and so this is there were 2 rebellions against the English. There was the 15 and the 45. There was 1715 and 1745. And the 1745 one ended in the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Yeah, they were all taken by the government, and some of them were given back. Some of them were sold by the government. Some of them were given to other nobles. As I'm sure many of you know, after Culloden, it was against the law, I think, for over 100 years to wear a kilt. To do anything Scottish in Scotland was just not allowed. And as recently as the early 20th century, the English wanted to rebrand Scotland as North Britain. And actually, I have some books here from 1913 that show the map, and it's called North Britain. It's not called Scotland, and England is South Britain. They tried to stomp out everything Scottish they possibly could after Culloden, and only very slowly did it come back. And the biggest thing that brought Scotland back as a unique identity and a culture was Queen Victoria and Prince Albert going to the Highlands and falling in love with it, and that then made it acceptable to allow Scottish culture to seep back into British culture.
And Jeannie asks, so are there a lot of Hamilton House or Palace pieces at the MFA in Boston?
There aren't. I mean, we have the room, you know, the place that has the best collection, I think, of things from Hamilton Palace that's not in a major museum is the National Trust for Scotland. If you look, for instance, at the credit line and some of those objects that I thought were so luscious that were in Hamilton Palace, they are in Buccleuch Castle, which is owned by the Trust on the Isle of Arran. And that the reason of that is Buccleuch Castle and the entire island at one point were owned by the Dukes of Hamilton. This is one of their many houses. And when it was given to the Trust in the 20th century, all the contents were given with it. And there was a decided reaction in later Dukes of Hamilton against objects that had come into their ownership through William Beckford because he was a homosexual. So a lot of the objects were taken from Hamilton Palace and put into the other residences, which is why we're so lucky that so many of them went to Buccleuch, because they're all still there today. As a matter of fact, I have a book here just on objects of William Beckford's that are at Buccleuch Castle. So if you want to see the best of what's left of a Hamilton collection, the best place to go is to Buccleuch. It is on an island, so you have to make a bit of an effort to go there, but it's an amazing place. As a matter of fact, I think it's on the back of a £5 note, Buccleuch Castle. It's pretty significant in Scottish history.
Now we have a question from Martha. How did these estates accumulate so many paintings? Were they sitting for their portraits often? Did they have artists brought in from other countries?
The answer to all of those questions is yes. They did have artists from other countries. They usually would come to the house and paint them. That certainly would happen when you saw the portraits of the Buccleuchs. The artists came to their house, particularly because they were dukes. A lot of the famous Grand Tour portraits, these were men who went on the Grand Tour primarily in the 18th century. They would be painted by Italians, particularly Bertoni, and you would take that portrait back with you as evidence of your culture having gone on the Grand Tour, primarily to Italy and secondarily to France. They inherited paintings, just what you saw with William Beckford's daughter, bringing in all of her father's art. So you merged together family after family. And of course, as you can all imagine, it was everyone's desire to marry somebody who was richer than themselves. And rich didn't mean just money, it also meant art. And you would bring family portraits, you would commission new family portraits, and it was essential for the eldest male in a title family to be painted repeatedly throughout his life, at various stages of his life. So all this comes together into these great repositories of art.
All right, maybe just a few more questions. I know we're almost at time here. Kenneth asks, besides Dumfries House, which sites that we went over today are open to the public?
Well, I'm going to say Ginevra is going to put this on our YouTube channel in probably tomorrow, maybe even tonight. And if you go through it again, you'll see on the first slide of each house, I have a little thing at the bottom right that tells you if the house is open or closed to the public. And as I'm scrolling through this right now, trying to see what I can see, obviously Hamilton Palace is not, because it doesn't exist anymore, but you can go to the grounds. Lennox Love House is open to the public. Ask Hall is open to the public in Yorkshire. Dundas House in Edinburgh is open to the public simply because it's a bank. So you can go in and look at it, which is wicked cool. Glamis is open to the public. Obviously, we talked about Dumfries. Drumlanrig is open to the public. And the church at Drumlanrig is open to the public as well. Bow Hill is open to the public. Yep, Mount Stewart, they're all open to the public. Yep, I'm going to say pretty much all of them.
All right. And as Curt mentioned, the recording of this presentation will be posted to our website and our YouTube channel. So you can catch anything that you missed. If you want to kind of revisit some of these houses and spend more time in the rooms and enjoy their interiors or exteriors, you can certainly do so, again, either on our website or our YouTube channel. And I'll be sending everyone an email with a link to that following today's broadcast. Let's see, we have just a few more questions. Vanessa asks, can you tell us about that flesh-colored armor that we saw? Where did it come from? Was it used for fighting? Anything else that you know about that very kind of odd color armor?
Well, we don't know if it ever existed, to be honest. It may have been an artist's conceit. It certainly wouldn't have been done without the approval of the Earl, so he obviously wanted it. It would not have been fought, and if it did exist, because armor by this time was obsolete, because bullets could penetrate it, so it lost its purpose. Men were shown in armor just as an homage to the past, just like you would show, like we see George Washington dressed as a Roman senator or as an emperor. It was just a thing going back to a distant past. So it wouldn't have had, even if it was real, any practical purpose.
All right. Well, I know that there were a lot of other questions and comments that we didn't get to today, but thank you everyone for your comments. If you do have additional questions, you can certainly reach us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. You see that on your screen now, and I'll be including that and some other information in my follow-up email later today. So thank you all for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. If you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and the fabulous heritage tours, many of which are led by Curt, please visit us at americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.